Hi, I'm Joe Feeks, editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Nate Winkleman. He is president of Swine Services Unlimited, and also Fernando Leite. He is also a veterinarian with the University of Minnesota and a graduate research assistant. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, we're going to be talking about ileitis today. And, I was under the impression, this is not a new disease, I was under the impression that we pretty much had this bug under control.
No, not at all. It's still considered the most common grow-finish cause of diarrhea in North America. It's ubiquitous in the swine industry. There's up to probably 96% of the farms in the United States that have either subclinical or clinical ileitis. Mm-hmm. So it's an old disease in one respect, in that it was first published and talked about in 1931 in the Diseases of Pathology, but it really wasn't known that the cause of ileitis, which is Lawsonia intracellularis, is a bacteria, that occurred in 1993. So we're continually doing research and learning about it.
I don't think anybody would doubt that it's ubiquitous in the pork industry, but with producers and veterinarians cutting back on antibiotics, are you seeing an increase in cases of ileitis?
Not so much yet. We expect that we might. Like I mentioned, it's the most common cause of diarrhea in the grow-finish period, and that's primarily because we feed antibiotics through the nursery period that control and mask the disease clinically. Now, as we're using less antibiotics, and the trend is towards less and less antibiotics, we expect that the disease will be in the nursery. And so if we don't have antibiotics in the nursery, ileitis will be a more common disease in the mid to late nursery period.
Isn't there a vaccine, though, available as well?
Yes, there are two commercial vaccines. One's an oral vaccine and one's an injectable or parental vaccine. But it takes at least 4 weeks to maximize immunity for that. So the timing isn't right to protect a nursery pig. So even though we have vaccines and they can be beneficial, we probably need to look at other alternatives.
But given the disease's history, I mean, it seems like we're playing with fire by taking the antibiotic out of those nursery feeds.
Yes, you can't replace antibiotics. We're just looking for other alternatives that might improve performance.
Okay. So what types of compounds are you looking at as a substitute for antibiotics, not a replacement, but a substitute in trying to keep ileitis in check?
So when we talk about antibiotic alternatives, I think it's important to consider one of the trials that we did wasn't aimed at killing Lawsonia itself, but really helping the host respond to the infection. Mm-hmm. So in one of the studies that we conducted together, we looked at a different form of zinc and supplementing the animal with a different form of zinc in a non-therapeutic level, because we know zinc oxide, for instance, at 2,000 to 3,000 ppm can have bactericidal activities. But the objective of our study was really to look at an organic form of zinc that can be absorbed differently by the animal to really enhance the animal's response to infection. We know that nutritional zinc levels and adequate supplement of zinc is necessary for a proper immune system.
So zinc was one of several options that you considered?
Actually, we in this particular study, we just investigated different forms of zinc. Mm-hmm. And we found that the zinc amino acid complex really helped the host minimize some of the negative impacts. Lesions is something that we observed. This zinc amino acid complex really helped reduce the number of animals and the severity of those lesions.
So reducing the severity of lesions is one thing, but how did that affect the performance of the herd?
I think that's a great question. Nate also had a great paper in ASV, and Connie and Fabio Vanucci have found that really the intestinal function is compromised by those lesions. Lawsonia pretty much compromises the absorptive capacity of the gut, and so lesions are correlated to weakened performance. And so I think anything that can help the host respond and minimize some of that pathology would be directly beneficial to the animal as in its production performance.
So what would be the takeaway message then from that aspect of the study? I mean, what do producers and vets need to understand about this particular form of zinc? And I guess most important, how to use it to have the same kind of results that you achieved?
Yeah. Well, I think, our results are very promising, but at the same time, reproducibility and doing this again would be good. But what we found was pretty conclusive that this different zinc form did really help the host respond to infection.
We measure a lot of different parameters to determine whether products that we test in randomized controlled trials are effective. Clinical signs are one. Does it decrease diarrhea? Does it prevent gauntness or a poor body condition score? Because the first thing that happens with pigs when they get ileitis is their feed intake decreases and then their average daily gain suffers. So it's a performance loss. And then they might get diarrhea. We measure the lesions because you can actually see the lesions. What happens with a disease like Fernando said is you get a thickening of the mucosa or the lining of the intestine, and so we don't absorb nutrients readily, and then you have a feed efficiency loss as well.
And what's pretty fascinating, I think, is that the effects of proper zinc supplement is not only particular to the swine, but for instance, the World Health Organization suggests zinc supplementation in developing countries for the aid in the treatment of diarrhea as well. And so zinc is really known to facilitate and to be important for intestinal health, not necessarily at the 3,000 to 2,000 ppm level, but proper zinc nutritional levels are very important to maintain intestinal health.
And based on the results that you've seen, is there any reason to believe that it could have a comparable effect on other enteric pathogens?
That's a great question. I mean, you would have to test that for sure, but I think potentially.
Denmark is a good country to discuss this because they've gone away from antibiotic growth promotants, and then ileitis all of a sudden became more of a problem in their nurseries. And so then they used high levels of zinc to help control their other enteric problems, but now they really realize it's an environmental contaminant. So now we have to make sure we don't cause more harm than good with our treatments.
Now, I understand you also looked at hyper-immunized chicken eggs as a means of trying to manage ileitis. Can you tell us about that?
So we found the zinc and the hyperimmunized chicken eggs that are nutraceuticals that do have a positive effect statistically in randomized controlled trials against an ileitis challenge. And the ileitis challenge just means that we're putting the products in the feed in this case with the egg antibody, and then we're giving the pigs the challenging them with the Lawsonia bacteria and measuring all these different parameters. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the hyperimmunized chickens, that just means we're strategically vaccinating chickens with the Lawsonia intracellularis antigen, and they mount an immune response in their body, and that's concentrated in the egg. And then you spray dry that egg. The antibody in the egg is still effective through the spray drying process as long as it's less than 160 degrees. And then you incorporate that in the pig feed. And as long as you're feeding the pigs that passive antibody, that's what it is, and they're exposed to this the Lawsonia intracellularis disease challenge, then it significantly improved average daily gain and feed intake in the face of a challenge.
Now, I've interviewed a lot of veterinarians in the poultry industry where they've also been looking at antibiotic alternatives, and they've looked at essential oils and oregano and what some people call pizza toppings, and with various levels of success. But it always seems that the takeaway message from all these trials is, well, it performed really great in this trial, but then we couldn't repeat it, or we could only repeat it twice, but we haven't been able to see that in the field. What's the likelihood that you might run into that with zinc, for example?
I think that's a good question, and the only way would be to test it. But you know, the literature to support that a nutritional adequate supplementation of zinc contributes to a proper host intestinal function and immune system is pretty big, not only in the porcine species but also in the human. So I think, you know, the answer is you'd have to try it, but I think it's very likely that it could.
You need to repeat it because repeatability is important. You know, it's there was a kind of a facetious statement yesterday by a well-known researcher that the best way to ruin a good research study is to repeat it. But that's not that. He was being facetious, and so we need to repeat it and make sure we got consistent results. With the egg antibody, because the results were so different, we had a 25% improvement in average daily gain and a 26% improvement in average daily feed intake. You'd expect that it would be more repeatable.
Okay. And really, again, we're doing all this research simply because we've got antibiotics that are effective, but we just rather not use them because of consumer pressure? I mean, is that really what's driving this?
Yeah, that's some of it. There's niche markets, and if the consumer is willing to pay for antibiotic-free or a no antibiotic-fed ever pig, then there are some niche markets, and some of the people on this antibiotic alternative program, they talked about the systems as veterinarians, the challenges that they have with that and how they control performance and mortality and morbidity from an animal welfare standpoint. So we have to be careful when we remove antibiotics. But when we do remove antibiotics, because there's a market for those pigs, we need to have alternatives, and these are a couple of them.
Never a dull moment in the pork industry.
No, we love it.
Okay. Gentlemen, thanks. We've been talking to Nate Winkleman from Swine Services Unlimited and also Fernando Ileitis from the University of Minnesota. Gentlemen, thanks again for telling us about your research.
Appreciate it, Joel. Thank you.